All right, I have the right recording going. So we'll go ahead and get started this evening. Welcome everyone to our January Courageous Conversations. So excited to have a conversation about food and find out if our race matters in what we are consuming. So Neil usually does the welcome, so bear with me. So I just wanted to remind you all that we will be following the 4 agreements of courageous conversation, which include stay engaged, expect and experience discomfort, speak your truth, and expect and accept lack of closure. Okay. This conversation is being recorded and will be available on YWCA Rock County's YouTube channel. That usually happens in a day or so after our discussion. Parts of the event may be recorded and used by media outlets, so I just want to keep everyone aware of that. Sorry, my notes just shrunk. And then just want to invite everyone, if you would like, feel free to turn your camera on. If it is not, we completely understand. So totally your call. At the end of the program, our partners will give any announcements that we have. And just for anyone that's new, the partners for this discussion are YWCA Rock County Community Action of Rock and Walworth County and the Diversity Action Team of Rock County. We invite you to stay for the parking lot, which is an unrecorded, unmoderated session from 7 to 7:30. If the conversation dies down a little before that, then we'll just play it by ear when we end. But once the parking lot is open, we invite anyone that's in the meeting, if you have a community announcement to share, please feel free to do that. Final thing I wanted to address before we get started with our videos and our discussions is that I wanted to let everyone know that we have put additional safeguards in place to protect against Zoom bombing. If we experience some challenges and the disturbance can't be immediately ejected, we will end the meeting and restart. So please do log back in. All right, so the structure of the evening, we do have guest speakers, which I'm really excited about. We'll start off with 2 videos to kind of frame our conversation. The first one is just over 3 minutes. And then the second one is a little bit longer at just under 11 minutes. We'll watch those back to back. And then I will introduce our guest speakers. We have a few questions that we want to begin with our speakers, and then we'll open up the conversation for everyone on the call. So if you give me a second, I will share my screen and we will begin with our first video.
I grew up in the city of Detroit in the 1960s. And while I was growing up, there were lots of folks in the city who had moved to Detroit from the South beginning in the 1920s, including my grandparents on both sides. There were grocery stores almost everywhere in the city. There was a national chain grocer within walking distance of every location inside the city of Detroit. That all changed by 2007 when Farmer Jack, the last of those national chain groceries, closed its doors and Detroit became labeled as a food desert. The USDA defines a food desert as a low-income census tract where a substantial number or share of residents has low access to supermarket or local grocery stores. There's multiple problems with the term food desert. One of the problems is that typically people think of a desert as a very barren landscape, and the reality is that a desert is actually a very vibrant ecosystem. Another problem with the definitions used of food deserts is that it presupposes that the answer to these areas that lack access to healthy food is more grocery stores. A third problem with the term food deserts is it's not a term that people living in those areas use to describe their own situation. It's similar to the term at-risk child used in schools. I was a school principal for several years and never heard a parent come to me and say, "This is my son, John. He's an at-risk child." This is a term which is imposed upon communities as opposed to a term that community members use to define their own condition. The fourth and perhaps most problematic issue with the term food desert is that it doesn't speak to the intentionality of the conditions that exist in communities that have low access to healthy foods. The reality is that public policy and economic practices have created these areas that have low access to foods, and food desert does not speak to that intentionality. Recently, the term food apartheid has resonated with myself and other food activists. Dara Cooper defines food apartheid as the systemic destruction of Black self-determination to control our food, including land, resource theft, and discrimination. A hypersaturation of destructive foods and predatory marketing, and a blatantly discriminatory corporate-controlled food system that results in our communities suffering from some of the highest rates of heart disease and diabetes of all times. Many tend to use the term food desert. However, food apartheid, according to Dar, is a much more accurate representation of the structural, racialized inequities perpetuated through our current food system. Whatever term we use to describe the situation, there are vast inequities in the American food system that are caused by historical, intentional, racist, and classist policies, resulting in far too many Black and brown and poor white people not having sufficient access to fresh, healthy, high nutrient dense, affordable food. I join with those who say that such access is a human right and that denying that right in one of the wealthiest nations in the world is unconscionable.
There are a few things that make me happier than physically farming. Big, sweaty, kind of brutal task. I think I've always known in some form that this farm and this work around connecting people and land needed to exist. You want to be free of your anxiety. I'm so happy. I think the wind likes it. My name is Leah Penniman, and I'm the founding co-director at Soulfire Farm in Grafton, New York. Soulfire Farm is a Black Indigenous-led community farm that's dedicated to ending racism in the food system and training up the next generation of activist farmers. Between 1% and 2% of farms are Black owned, which is down from a peak of 14% of Black owned farms in 1910. And this is not because Black folks don't want to farm. This is because of a whole legacy of discrimination, of institutional racism. I grew up in a small rural town called Ashburnham, Massachusetts. I'm the oldest of 3, and we were, for most of our childhood, the only brown kids in our entire school. And we experienced just a lot of social exclusion and racial bullying. It ranged from taunting, being called names, to assumptions about our intelligence. The land and the forest were a salvation for me. I attended every single farming conference that I could afford to go to. But by my late teens, early 20s, I started to get disillusioned because I look around these farming conferences and all the presenters were white. And I looked around and there was only a handful of people of color. A mentor of mine said something so important to me at that time. She was just like, look, don't give up. I know that right now it seems like you're out of place, but remember that our ancestors have been farmers for millennia and that our ancestors built the agricultural system of this country on their backs. I was really grateful that she was there and encouraged me to stick with it. My partner Jonah and I were living in the south end of Albany, New York with our then infant children, Nashima and Emmett. And despite our master's degrees and over a decade of farming experience, found it impossible to get fresh food for our children. There were no supermarkets, no farmers markets, no available community garden plots. The only food is a corner store, a liquor store, and a McDonald's. This system of segregation is termed by the government a food desert. To us, there's nothing natural about apartheid. So we call it what it is. It's food apartheid. It comes out of a legacy of redlining and housing discrimination, of divestment from communities of color, and has resulted in the situation today where if you're white, you're 4 times as likely to have a supermarket on your block than if you're Black. You're more likely to have diabetes, heart disease, and other diet-related illnesses, not because you don't know how to eat, but because there, is a scarcity of affordable, culturally appropriate quality food that's accessible. And so we work to establish a community garden right on the corner plot near our home. So when our neighbors found out that we knew how to farm, they encouraged us to start the farm for the people. And the idea for Soul Fire Farm was born. We purchased the land in 2006, and it took us 4 years to transform this marginal, degraded, and vacant land into human habitat and suitable farmland. And we opened the farm in 2011 with a small food distribution program that went right to our neighbors in the South End. What's up, Einstein? Couple thousand folks roll through here every year to attend our farm training programs. The rest of you are just going to contemplate and pray for the strawberry happy homemaking. There are 8 of us working here on the farm. We have an amazing team. We have a number of day-long programs and week-long camps for youth who are interested in farming, and a whole lot of community days and workshops on particular skills. It's really whatever our community is asking us for, we do our best to provide. Our most popular is the week-long BIPOC Fire, stands for Black, Indigenous People of Color, Farming in Relationship with Earth. We have folks coming from 37 states and 3 countries this year, Spanish and English speakers, young and old. And we spend a week together doing hands on the land training. We have a number of courses on business management, marketing, as well as crop planning. If you count everyone who's gone through any program, we have over 10,000 alumni. We provide ongoing and forever mentorship. We hook folks up with jobs, land, fellowships, and other opportunities. You know, land is the place where the lynchings, the beatings, the enslavement, the sharecropping took place. And so there's no way to escape the trauma associated with that. And so a big part of what I and we are trying to do at Soulfire is to reach back across the narrative of the hundreds of years of land-based oppression to Cleopatra's, compost piles and the raised beds of the Ovambo people in Namibia, to reach back to the work of Dr. George Washington Carver, creating regenerative agriculture, and Dr. Booker T. Watley with Farm to Table. So to really reclaim the dignity of it is super important. If we can't feed ourselves, we can't truly be free. All right, so everyone who's part of the party, just come a little to get started. We're going to travel around the farm together, get a chance to visit some of the sacred sites, hear the stories, and you can ask your questions as well as we go. So follow me this one. Community Farm Day is our monthly public event where volunteers come from all around the region to share in the labor of the land, to have a potluck lunch, and then to participate in a tour and Q&A session. It's the one time that the farm's open to the public. Now, what's very important with strawberries is that their meristem or growth point is right here. So what do you think happens if you bury that?
Drown.
It will not grow. We have a bunch of different teams working on different tasks, including transplanting the fall strawberries, cleaning and curing the garlic and onions, harvesting potatoes, removing some of the materials and supplies that we're done with for the season. And Jonah will be working with some volunteers, many of whom have traveled 3 or 4 hours just to get here today. We have a lot of teens that come through the farm, and not all of them are going to be farmers, but they see folks who look like them following their dreams and being their own bosses and running their own institutions. What matters to me is that they can see a wider vision of what's possible for their own lives.
This is what we're trying to get to, so it's great to see it in person. Yeah, it's a book. It makes my heart flutter. Like, honestly, I'm so inspired.
When I say 5, you say minutes. 5. Until lunch, which means you should please help all the teams clean up and put everything away. We do doorstep delivery of vegetables, eggs, pastured meat, and herbs, and folks can actually pay for that using their EBT benefits. The vast majority of people say that having those vegetables has made a huge difference in their health, whether that's a reduction in blood pressure or cholesterol or overall sense of well-being. And especially for our lower income members, many of them say if it wasn't for those vegetables, they'd literally be eating ramen and boiled pasta and canned foods because they simply don't have anywhere to get, fresh food like we offer. There's nothing that makes me happier than seeing our alumni farm. So for example, Dallas Robinson in North Carolina just recently opened the Harriet Tubman Farm. Folks like Keisha Cameron outside of Atlanta, Georgia at High Hog Farm. Fundamentally, I want to create a different kind of educational environment for young people that I never got to experience, where you can go ahead and be proud to be a soil nerd, and you also will have your culture uplifted, your heritage uplifted, and be affirmed for who you are and encouraged to pursue your wildest dreams.
I see Leah and I stand there and I listen to her and I'm just in complete awe. Like I feel a physical reaction in my body and I just want to be quiet and listen.
I've had mixed feelings in the past around doing public speaking. It always seemed like the real work was here on the farm, and then I'd go out and just talk about the real work. And something shifted for me when I witnessed how many people who heard our talks then went on to join a program to learn how to farm, or did something like give away their land to a Black farmer. It's really an honor and pleasure to be here with all of you. I feel excited. I feel deeply pleased to talk about two of my favorite things, which are the earth and the ancestors and what they want us to be up to. Our waiting list for our training programs is years long. Our people are yearning, right? Some of us confuse the scene of the crime, which was the land, with the crime. But the fact is the land has always had our back. In fact, we survived because of that connection with the land. My hope is that we spread our love, our knowledge, our resources out through the network of Black and Brown farmers so that, 10, 20 years from now, people will be like, wait, what's Soul Fire again? Because there's literally right around the corner a Black and Brown led teaching farm, so that it becomes so commonplace that we have to remind our children about a time when all the land was white owned and a time when all the farmers were exploited, because that's become such a distant memory.
All right. So I wanted to do those two videos. We're going to stick a pin in both of them just for now, but hold on to everything that you saw and heard and hopefully learned, because we're going to come back for it to come back to it for a discussion. I am scrolling to make sure that all right, I see two of our guests here. So I'll go ahead and get them introduced, and then we'll start with the questions that we have prepared for them, and then definitely open up the floor so that you all can join in the discussion. So I want to welcome Joe Lochner, who's the operations supervisor of ECHO in Janesville. And I also want to introduce Sherry Tussler, who is the executive director of Hunger Task Force, and that's located in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So Joe and Sherry, thank you so much for being with us. Joe, if you could turn your camera on, that would be great. If not, just throw something in the chat, and that's completely fine as well. So Sherry, I'll get started with you with our first question. Well, first, please introduce yourself and then we'll jump in.
Sure. My name is Sherry Tussler. I'm the executive director at Hunger Task Force. I've been with Hunger Task Force for 25 years. We are an anti-hunger public policy organization. We operate a farm, a food bank, and we engage in advocacy work around the federal nutrition assistance programs.
Perfect. Thank you so much and welcome, Sherry. Joe, are you able to unmute and introduce yourself?
Yep. And you were close on the name. I'm always interested to see how people pronounce it or add letters because there's no N. But it happens all the time. I'm always curious to see. Yeah, I'm the operations supervisor at ECHO. I do a lot of the day-to-day things that Jessica gives me.
Okay, I froze up for a minute. So Joe, do me a favor. Please pronounce your last name for me so I can make sure I get it right.
It's just a long O, Loker.
Loper. All right. I'm writing myself a note. Thank you. Okay, so the first question that we have prepared is, do you see racial and socioeconomic inequities in access to healthy food in the clients you serve? And then an example of this may be local zoning policies that limit urban farming or location to grocery stores. And I'll put that question in the chat as well.
I mean, we definitely see it's mostly for us as the grocery stores. Fortunately, we're located downtown, kind of where most of our clients are, in the Fourth Ward area on the south side. The farther they are on the south side, obviously the harder time they have even getting to us, let alone any of the grocery stores in the area. So I know a lot of them just depend on us being there. We have tried to expand some of our like overnight food bags. We have some things at the library and at the YMCA. But when it comes to healthy foods, unfortunately, that's not a lot of the things that we get. So even then, they're very limited on the access that they can have because it's not easy to get up to the north side without a vehicle, especially sometimes, Sundays and at night, if that's when you can go, they can't do it. So.
Right. And Joe, does Echo provide any like delivery services, or do clients really have to make it to you in order to access goods?
So we don't really have the capacity to deliver food. We have a volunteer, I don't know if it's a group, I think they're through, is it through RVCP? I don't remember exactly where they're from. They deliver some to seniors or anybody with disabilities, and they're generally only doing maybe like 2 to 5 a week. It's mostly just a capacity. We don't have the manpower to deliver, but we do have that for certain folks who want to take advantage of that. And I don't know how long they're going to do it. It's a volunteer thing that they're doing for us, but we're so happy that they've continued. So.
No, great. And then we always like to end with, is there something that we can do to help? So maybe if you can remind us before we close out to get the word out, if people want to volunteer and hopefully expand those capacities, that sounds like that would be a really good use of efforts. Sherry, again, thank you so much for joining us. Same question. And I noticed that you mentioned that you all do farm work. So if you could include some of that information with your response, that would be awesome. So again, the question is, do you see racial and socioeconomic inequities in access to healthy food in the clients that you serve?
Yeah, that's why we're here. We were established 40 years ago as the Concerned Citizens for School Breakfast because our Milwaukee Public Schools was not providing breakfast to kids. We were the Black Panther Party, a group of advocates, parents and teachers who wanted to see breakfast provided. And so it's been an ongoing history of racial injustice. Some of those populations that I've seen over the course of my career have really definitely expanded. Leaving Milwaukee and going to places north of Highway 8 in Wisconsin. The tribal nations, the rural and remote spaces of Wisconsin really struggle, not just with access to a grocery store, but the healthy foods and affordable foods. Right now in Lac de Flambeau, as an example, 18 eggs goes for $10. And so people have a really hard time making ends meet. On the times when I have visited places like the Bad River Nation or the Red Cliff Nation, the stores are first not there and second not open on Sunday or Monday. So it can be a bit of a struggle for people to access food that's both affordable and fresh. I think that also would like to just reflect that, here I'm sitting in my historic house located in a really awful neighborhood in Milwaukee, where I'd like to comment that first video, there's a suggestion that more stores would matter. And I live in what would be classified as a food desert, very diverse neighborhood, but there are no grocery stores. And lots of people try to organize around putting a grocery store together. But the problem is that I might shop at a different store than you might shop at, Amy, that Joe might shop at. And so even if you were to ask, do you want an Aldi? Do you want a Pick and Save? What do you want? No one can agree on the store format itself. And so making those judgments just based on geography or distance isn't very effective in terms of informing the need or desire for a store. And then with regard to our farm, we grow about 500,000 pounds of fresh produce annually. And we distribute that intentionally to the food pantry network in Milwaukee County, which is made up of 51 food pantries. We've also got some senior public housing and dining sites that we also assist. But the access to fresh produce can't be underscored enough. People really appreciate having not only locally raised foods, foods that are free of pesticides, and foods that respect their cultural and racial and religious diversity.
So Sherry, thank you for that response. There's so much there, and I'm gonna
Sorry.
ask a couple questions, and then I'm gonna open up to the audience. I don't want to hog you. You mentioned the Black Panther Party. Was that you do similar work like feeding children, or is there a direct connection to some aspect of the Black Panther Party?
The Black Panther Party, as well as registered dietitians inside the Milwaukee Public Schools and various parent advocates, were the reason for our first establishment as the Concerned Citizens for School Breakfast.
Okay. So yeah, I really appreciate that acknowledgement. And then just a quick question. You said that 500,000 pounds of produce, is that year round?
We'll get started in May with asparagus and some lettuces, and we'll go through November when we end up with some of our colder season cabbage and squash. And so the height of the season is clearly August and September. October is pretty good too. But we do live in Wisconsin, so June and July aren't going to be quite as abundant.
Okay, sounds good. So I'm going to open the floor if anyone has a question so far for Joe or for Sherry. If you put a question mark in the chat, I will know to call on you. If you want to type your question in the chat, we can read that directly from there. If it is of somewhat a sensitive nature, you can always direct message me. Same rules apply. I will read the content of the question without revealing the author. So I'm going to pause. And again, if you want to ask a question, just throw a question mark in the chat, please. All right, so seeing no question marks, we're going to move on to our second question that I've prepared for you. Does your organization provide education on the realities of food access disparities with respect to race? And just to add a little clarity to that question, I'm certain you don't have to do too much education with your clients. But Joe, in your case, you basically, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm paraphrasing, that you distribute the food that you receive. Is there intentional education to the entities that you receive food from about access disparities, about culturally inviting foods for the different populations of your clientele? And then Sherry, I'll have the same question for you.
For the most part, yes, it's mostly just what we receive. We do get to place orders through like Second Harvest for whatever items that they have. So we're very limited on what we can even get through, that way. Education, we always try to tell them we want, healthy foods, we want more produce, we want stuff like that instead of the, boxed meals and things like that. But fortunately, we kind of take what we can get, which a lot of times seems to be what lasts the longest and ends up being the unhealthy stuff. So we try to tell them as much as we can, but I think they're kind of strapped on what they get too, even with Second Harvest, because they're getting secondhand from grocery stores with whatever doesn't sell that they can donate right off, and then we can get. But it's difficult because there's no real way for us to make sure that we're getting the healthier stuff. Because they have a source as well, so.
Right. It just seems like there's not the leverage there to kind of make requests. It's what you can access.
Yeah, and we have a food budget that we can order stuff, and we use that throughout the year to get some of those extra things. We have connections through like Sam's Club and all that too, where we get a lot of produce from them. which we can, fortunately, we get enough that we can also share some with other pantries around the area. But there's a lot of stuff that we just don't get in it.
Right. Sherry, could you talk a little bit about connections that you have outside of the farming that you mentioned, and how food comes in from those other entities? And is there any intentional education about food access disparities? What do those conversations look like, sound like?
Sure. Hunger Task Force is a free and independent food bank, which means that we're not part of Second Harvest or Feeding America. They source most of their products from the back of the grocery store for foods that would not regularly be sellable to them, but they still view as having some nutrient value. We have rejected that model, and we believe that the people that we serve should have the same access to the same high quality foods that you and I would want to eat. And so it starts out with donated food and us running large scale community food drives that we've done literally for decades. And so if anybody's gone to the Wisconsin State Fair and gotten in for 2 cans of fruit and its own juice, that was us. If you've gone to Summerfest and donated food, that was us. So those food drives then became a source of food for us. We also are the trusted administrative agent for the federal commodity programs. And although those foods can be boring, canned goods, shelf-stable things, we have seen an uptick from the federal government, especially since the pandemic, in providing more frozen and even fresh foods. And then we combine the farm produce, and then ultimately we work with corporate partners to raise their awareness so that we can purchase food outright by the truckloads, and then we give that food away. And so the intentionality around that, especially the education piece involving the recipients of our food as well as the donors of our food, was we adopted the USDA My Plate model for healthy eating. And what that means is that half of your plate should be fruit and vegetables, and the other half should be grains that are whole and meats that are lean with some dairy at the top. And in adopting that, whenever food comes in through our food drives, and Joe's going to want to kill me for this, we throw away anything that isn't healthy. We literally throw away ramen noodles. Icky, old. We always say, if you wouldn't give it to your best friend in trouble, don't give it to us, because we're going to throw it away anyways. So it's an education thing that we've been at for several decades, and it works. It works for us. We've always had enough food, although we are about to enter a time with the end of government emergency food share allotments where it's looking kind of scary for everybody. We have remained true to educating people about those healthy foods. And I can say that at the pantry level, when a consumer walks into a pantry, they never ever say, where are my cookies? Where are my ramen noodles? They get healthy foods, they get fresh foods, and they're excited about it. And they're thankful for the support that we give them. And I think that it's impacted our overall public health.
So Sherry, I'm going to ask you a question that you may deem to be controversial, and feel free to push back. One, do you believe that slightly less healthy food, well, less healthy food is better than no food?
Well, of course.
Okay, so let me ask you this. With the items that you would throw away, if you know that other entities would distribute that food to people who are in need, have there been discussions to give that food to food pantries that will utilize it in lieu of throwing it away?
Maybe that's a better question for Joe. Do you want our leftovers, Joe?
If it's edible and can feed somebody who's hungry, we don't turn down food ever. So if it's open bad or stuff like that, we obviously will get rid of it. But if we can feed somebody with it, we'll always take it.
So the work over the years has been to educate people about those ramen noodles and about other highly processed foods, and to remind people that that a steady diet of complex carbohydrates makes people heavy. It makes them sick. causes heart disease and diabetes, things like that. And so even though what we do may be deemed by some people as controversial, that food that is rescued from the back of the grocery store probably belongs in a dumpster and was in a dumpster before we started food banking. And underneath all of that, what Joe has sort of alluded to is, and selling that food. And that's more food apartheid than probably all of us recognize, because food banks across the nation make millions of dollars selling food to food banks, or excuse me, to food pantries like Joe's.
Yes,
One
they call it
penny,
sharing costs.
Yep, shared maintenance fee, 19 cents a pound.
Yes.
So if I went to the store and I bought a can of vegetables for 50 cents or $1, if 19 cents of it had to be spent by Joe to get it to his food pantry, then what's going on there? What's the food apartheid there?
No, I think that's really interesting. And what I also heard Joe say was that, yes, they don't turn down food. So I'm just saying there may be an opportunity there to put food in the hands of people that don't have food. And I completely hear what you're saying is, if you wouldn't give it to your best friend in need, don't give it to us. All right. So I'm gonna go to the chat. Have there been attempts at community gardens in Janesville and Beloit? Our participants are so great. I see there's already an answer in there. Does anyone know about community gardens in Janesville? I know we are so fortunate to have the Merrill Community Garden in Beloit, which is free and open to the public. I know Caleb Lokrantz and the team at Community Action does an amazing job with maintaining that garden. Anyone, please feel free to jump in if you have information about a community garden or anything similar in Janesville.
I posted something about community gardens in Janesville.
Okay, by St. Patrick's Church. I see that now. Okay, and the Rock County Jail has a community garden. Is that just for its residents, or is that for other members of the community? Sally, you're shaking your head. Please go ahead and unmute.
I believe that's for anybody, because you see people gardening there off and on at different times. So it looks like it is just, you just sign up for a garden.
Okay. All right. And then I know that some of you are interested in sharing the videos or rewatching those. If it was, I got a message that it was kind of breaking up, so my apologies for that. So the first and second video, the links are in the chat, and then there's an additional video that we just didn't have time to watch. Again, it's Leah Penniman. So that is available as well. Just scrolling through the rest of the chat. Okay. So our last question, and then I want to shift to another video, and then we can have a conversation about that. For both Joe and Sherry, what do you want people to know about the challenges of food insecurity that we maybe have not discussed? And what can we do to help?
I mean, the biggest thing that working at a charity, what we hear a lot of times is, I know somebody mentioned, I think it was Sherry actually, the food share, the extra benefits ending. We hear here and there, oh, people wasting their food share on this and wasting their food share on that. But exactly what we're talking about is, if somebody down, even where our building is, could get to a grocery store to get healthier stuff, they wouldn't opt to spend all of their food share at a gas station. And I'm just so tired of hearing people say that. I know that they do it. It's a fact. They go and do that, but it's not because they want to, it's because they have to, which is unfortunately the same thing that we would love to just give out only healthy food, only healthy produce, all that kind of stuff. And unfortunately, what we end up getting is the things that just simply feed people because that's what we get. It bothers me too, but it's what we do, so.
Sherry, same question. What does this audience know about food insecurity that we may have not covered up to this point? And then more importantly, what can we do to provide help? How can we be of assistance?
The Wisconsin legislature is going to be putting a referendum on the April ballot where we're all supposed to express a vote on whether or not we think that people who receive public assistance should have to work for that assistance. That's targeted at food share, the food stamp program, Medicaid, and TANF, which is the old aid for families with dependent children. I want people to know that 46% of the people on food share live in a household where someone's working. And I want people to know that a third of the total population on food share is elderly, blind, and disabled. And so I want people to know that their legislator, their elected person, is trying to muster up some serious shit talk about poverty again, and that they should get angry about it and call them and tell them to stop it.
That was clear. Thank you.
It's been a long day.
Okay. So the next thing I'm going to put in the chat, if any of you are familiar with a podcast called Code Switch, I love Code Switch. They air on Saturdays. I'm going to drop this one on the chat, and it's revisiting how the other half eats. And it brought up some really interesting points. So I just put the link. If you don't do anything else, one, rewatch this so you can hear the fire and the passion from both Joe and Sherry, especially with how we can get involved and what we can do to help. And then two, make sure that you watch this episode. I am just going to go through some points that were brought up in the episode, and I'm going to open the floor for anyone to respond to add, we'll work with it. And then there's another video that I want us to watch to kind of frame the next part of our conversation. So again, the title of this podcast is Revisiting How the Other Half Eats, which is a book. I'll drop that information in a little bit. But one of the points that it brings up is the challenges with eating and feeding. How does culture play into your choices? And what role does assimilation play in the food that you're eating? And Joe, we hear you. It kind of sounds like your hands are tied to a certain extent and you distribute what you're able to get in. And there's not a lot of leverage there to request or demand a different type of food. But for Sherry, it seems like your organization has a bit more flexibility. Are you able to be intentional about culturally important foods for your clients? Or do you see that there is a sense of assimilation with your palate? And if someone is not necessarily from this country, but now they are eating foods that are traditionally American, for lack of a more detailed term. Do you see that with your clientele, and is there some intentionality around avoiding that?
Absolutely. I think when we talk about food, we should always ask the other person, what do you eat and why do you eat it? And then how can I help you get access to that? And so with an influx of Afghan refugees in the spring of last year, we had to think about halal foods and the humane raising of both meat and butchering of meat. During the pandemic, we were confronted with TFAP, the government Khmer program is giving us 1 pound bags of white rice. But what we need is jasmine rice and basmati rice because those are critical to certain people's diets. And so it's always important to listen. I do remember years ago, a pastor calling me and saying that he had a bunch of Somali refugees that were influxing in and he needed to get them food. And I was like, what do they eat? And he said, pizza. And I'm like, really? That's it? And so there's going to be a level of assimilation because who the hell doesn't like pizza, right? But what do they really eat? And then what do you want to get them? Things like infant formula. You have to think about specialty needs for infants and whether or not you can actually pass on that can of infant formula, depending upon the child's health. And so there are health issues that also impact what we eat. and not just race or culture, ethnicity. But everybody's different and they're going to like what they like. And we should try through client choice to respect their decisions at the food pantry. And so food pantries here in Milwaukee are set up like a small store where you can walk through and pick the items. Because Amy, if I gave you Fruit Loops, you might say, but wait a second, I like Cheerios. And there's no sense in wasting food. So if I give you the choice to choose your foods, you'll be a lot happier. It'll be much more dignified for you. And then I won't waste any food because maybe Joe likes the Fruit Loops.
No, that's
Give
really
my
good.
wife.
So that sets me up for my next question. This came directly from the podcast, and it made me think about food in a way that I hadn't before. So I appreciated that. And one of the things that they discussed was using food as a social status marker. And I never thought about that. And so they were talking about how one mom wanted her kids specifically to eat as if they belonged in the middle class. And for her, the interpretation of that was that they ate kale and avocados and yogurt and things like that. Do you ever experience, and Sherry, you're laughing and I want to know why, people who use food as a social status marker, and that your food says something about who you are, not just your preferences? Sherry, and then Joe, and then if anyone in the audience wants to jump in, just throw a question mark in the chat.
I've met a lot of foodies in my day, and I don't feel like we actually started using that term to describe people who really appreciate, love, or enjoy their food until probably about halfway through my career. But the foodies, yeah, that's what makes me laugh, is because it is a social status. Like, oh, I've got a smoothie and it's got kale in it. And okay, I'm just like good if you got half your plate being vegetables. So I just taking it to another level where we get preoccupied with the food. And I don't know that that's really as far in that direction as I want to go. I just want people to have access to healthy food and not get really about showing off their food.
Got it. So Joe, a slightly different question for you. So let's say a client makes it to your offices to be able to access the food that you're able to provide. Is it everyone gets the same thing or a similar package of food? Or is there that client autonomy where they can go through and choose, like, I would like these items and then these items to go with it? How does that logistically work?
So a little bit of both. Unfortunately, with how the building was built, 19 years ago, they had put the pantry in the basement, which makes it very difficult to be a full choice pantry. So what we do is when they sign in, we give them a sheet that has household items and all that kind of stuff on there, but they can also put items that they specifically want or specifically do not want. Aside from that, unfortunately, they are going to get bulk items that are basically the same as everyone else, but they have a little choice of, I'd like a little more like red meat and not chicken, or I'd like more chicken and not pork or something. They can always let us know and the volunteers will accommodate as they're packing. But unfortunately, with how the building was structured, it's impossible to be a full choice pantry like that. We'd really like to. I know I visited Walworth County's food pantry once, and it's great. It's like walking through like a little shopping mall. You got all the produce here and you got all the pastas here and canned stuff here, which is how our basement's set up. It's just, we can't get everybody down and around and through all that, going through our whole building to do it. They didn't unfortunately have the foresight when they built it, but we try to accommodate as best we can by just asking them, what do you want? What do you not want? So.
Perfect. So I am going to shift us into our second to the last video. We'll end with a really brief video that's about 3 minutes. But the next video is.
And I wanted to say something because you asked Sherry the question about I forget exactly how you worded it, but I was thinking like food as a status. I was thinking the people, they're already going to the store with a food share card and potentially being, ashamed or whatever of being there. Going not being able to eat the same foods that they did before if they lost their job or something like that. And suddenly they're eating ramen noodles and rice or whatever. Like now their friends and family all know too. I know because when I was growing up, I didn't know my family was on food share for a couple months because my parents didn't change any of that. They tried to make sure that we didn't know. They fed us the same things. I think they cut back on like soda that they'd buy us, but I can't imagine like even going to the food or going to buy food with a food card in the first place, but let alone letting my neighbors potentially know if I'm inviting them over. So I just things that I think about sometimes. So.
No, thank you for sharing that. So the next video, it's an hour in length. We're only going to watch about 10, 11 minutes of it. Just give you a heads up. It's kind of annoying in the beginning because the way the camera is perched, you can see people walking alongside it. That will eventually end, but I think the content is really good, and that's why I kept the video. So I'm just going to do a brief introduction because the one in the video is pretty lengthy, so we can jump right in. But it's Ijeoma Oluwe, and who is the author of So You Want to Talk About Race, which many of you may be familiar with, and Soleil Ho, who is a restaurant critic of the San Francisco Chronicle and host of the podcast. I don't know if it's still current, but it used to be called Racist Sandwich, discuss the intersections of food and so as a social construct, and how it defines our world. This was recorded in February of 2019. So kind of pre-pandemic to kind of give some context for this. So give me one moment and I will queue up the video. All right.
How do our food, agriculture, and restaurant industries participate in and support structural racism? Here, I'm thinking about problems such as food deserts and food access, dollar stores replacing grocery stores in low-income communities, lack of minority ownership in food industries, regulation of EBT benefits, exploitation of immigrant labor in the field, in the kitchen, and so forth. Most importantly, what can and should be done about the racial inequalities in our food system and our food culture?
Oh man, it's a lot. Yeah. I mean, as you put it, right? Food is just inherently political because it is a thing that exists in this world. It doesn't make any sense when I say it like that, but to me, that's what makes it political. There's so many things that lead up to us, like to the moment in which we like consume something. You think about labor politics, gender politics, race politics, geopolitics. And so I guess to kind of give a really shallow, like beginning shot of an answer, I think that, you know, when you think about like consumer politics, there's so many things rolled up into the single kind of bite, you know, the single thing that you have that it's a fertile like jumping off point to talk about all these bigger things. And it's so accessible to everyone because everyone eats food, you know, probably. Yeah.
I would say too, food is a finite resource, and any finite resource in a capitalist system is going to be exploited by a capitalist system, and race is also a product of a capitalist system, race as we know it. And so they are going to intertwine, and any time that there are resources of limited means, resources that can be commodified, that can have a price, that price is often going to, like many other things, seek to benefit those on top and exploit those on the bottom. So we have a lot of issues today. Our food is absolutely ingrained in race, and how we think about race, even if we're talking about issues of immigration and who's helping produce our food. When we talk about issues of freedom and who gets to choose what we eat and who doesn't, who has access to healthy food and who doesn't. Even simple, you know, I was talking with locally where I live in Seattle, we have a huge debate over building a new youth detention center. And just noticing things that our juvenile detention center, our alternative high schools, and our prisons all have food made by the same company that often also times exploits prison labor, and that's primarily people of color, kids of color in the same pipeline that includes just the basic lack of a decent meal while you're also being dehumanized in so many other ways. And how often, and the fact that oftentimes it's prisoners of color who are forced to participate in the system of further harming young people of color who are just being introduced into this harmful system. So there are so many different ways in which food, even talking beyond many of the things that we talk about in the news about exploitation and things like that of, you know, certain indigenous dishes or things like that, even the process of creating our food and marketing our food and selling our food ends up falling in this system of racial exploitation and oppression.
And what I find really fascinating about it, about food as a political entity, is the way we consume food media is so wrapped up in appearances and the final product and just, you know, when you think about Instagram and just all you see is the plate, right? And that's kind of how we consume new foods, new ideas about food is just the final product without any sort of context. And, you know, the work that I do is an attempt to bring that context back because there's so many deep stories and so many just like huge issues inherent in it. But if we disconnect the product from those stories, then we just become a purely like consumptive, like just, I don't know, meaningless culture, which is so dramatic. But I think if you don't, then what difference does one plate have against another plate? Like what meaning is there?
But I think it also really depends on the food itself, because that also falls within hierarchies of the patriarchy and white supremacy, right? Because certain food is revered, right? And, you know, your Michelin chefs that are primarily helmed by white men, all of the focus is on the process and the work and, you know, how people even assume that it's much harder to make than it is. But work that's primarily done by people of color or by women, that sort of food work is simplified. It's turned into like this drudgery or like this adventure that you're supposed to only pay a couple of bucks for. Those are your cheap eats. And so even that ends up falling in these harmful patterns. You know, there are so many people who spend, you know, you're a chef or you're a home cook. Right. And even people who work in restaurants somehow don't get to be called a chef unless they are kind of working in this Anglo male environment and doing this sort of style of cooking, even though there are plenty of even those simple ways in which families in the Midwest are cooking are oftentimes far more complicated than a lot of chefs in restaurants are cooking. And I think that, you know, it's interesting to see the oversimplification that I find a lot on social media are for a lot of dishes that are oftentimes overlooked, a lot of, you know, culturally significant dishes for cultures that are non-white. But there's very few, like, we're going to learn how to make coq au vin in 5 minutes, right? Like, that's not a thing you find on like the Instagram stories, you know, that it will be like how to make this incredibly complicated Thai dish in 5 minutes, you know, and cutting every corner. And it's kind of this general lack of respect and divorcing people from the process.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, when you mention cheap eats, that is just everything, right, about this. When you think about, for instance, I mean, just restaurants that are primarily owned by people of color or in communities of color, people will go to these restaurants, like maybe a taqueria, right? And they say like, oh, this taco is like perfect. It's $1 per taco. Like that's the best. And then, you know, when a Mexican chef attempts to open a restaurant and charge $12 for the taco and pay their workers living wages and buy ingredients that are local, organic, whatever, people complain, right? So there's all this complication to like whose labor deserves to be paid more and whose labor can just be considered an externality to the price of the food.
And of course, a fusion chef could open up their own version of like tacos that don't look like tacos and charge $20 a taco, and people will line up to buy it.
Yeah, and related to the home cooking thing too, the binary is so fascinating. And what I find really interesting is one of the big cookbooks of this past year was on fermentation by Renee Redzepi and the team at Noma, this really lauded, internationally known restaurant in Denmark. And, you know, he's a super famous chef, right? And the idea behind the book about fermentation was introducing fermentation to the home kitchen. And to me, that just seems so weird. Like, isn't that where most fermentation has taken place around the world, right? Like people who cook at home, like burying pots of kimchi in their backyards, and people making sauerkraut in the basement. So, like that's
pickles.
Yeah, it's like a normal thing that people do. But when you chefify it, you can sell a book for like $40 on it.
And some of those foods are also foods that are produced out of necessity, that have become glorified in some ways because perhaps a white chef picked it up and sold it as a sort of upper class cuisine.
Yeah, I saw like there was a feature like on New York Times on Kool-Aid pickles. And I was just like, y'all are kidding me, right? Like, Kool-Aid, first off, Kool-Aid pickles are gross. But they're also like a necessity when you're a kid, man. They're sweet, they're salty, they're cool, they're really cheap because a shop owner can just pour a pack of the Kool-Aid in a jar of pickles. It's a real staple in a lot of areas of the Black community and in the Southern community. And suddenly New York Times is like, ooh, check out these Kool-Aid pickles. And we're like, y'all don't need to stain your fingers like that. Like, that's just, that was an affordable snack. It's not anything. I don't know anyone like from my community that was looking to take that to make a thing. But you know, also like I really hope that there's some like gentrifiers out there paying $12 for a Kool-Aid pickle. I really hope so.
Yeah, hopefully they're getting paid. Yeah, they're getting paid for it.
Yeah, because other people haven't been. So.
Yeah, I know, exactly. Yeah. So let me move on to another topic that I think a lot of people are probably interested in, which is the topic of cultural appropriation. Still a topic that we have to talk about. And both of you devoted some attention in your work to this concept, the adoption or exploitation of another culture by a dominant culture, what Bell Hooks has called eating the other, desiring the other. For instance, Jomia talks about the dispiriting experience in her book, finding an African restaurant in the airport that had no Ethiopian or Nigerian cuisine, but instead zebra prints and cave drawings on the wall. Soleil has also highlighted her own experience as well, as interviewed a number of chefs of color who note the problematic nature of white chefs being celebrated for their use of exotic ingredients, fusion cuisines, and so forth. How do we promote appreciation for diverse experiences and cultural practices without engaging in exploitation? No pressure.
I would say, first of all, it starts with appreciating the creators and the producers. And so often we try to skip past that. Like people find this thing, they like it, they go to a restaurant, they're like, oh, I want to make my version of this. They don't stop and think, I really appreciate the person that made this, and I appreciate the culture that made this and sustains this. And that looks different because when you do that, then you're actually seeking out that art form and you're seeking out the people that do it and you want them to continue to do it and you invest in them. You know, I always have, when I find like a really great restaurant that I can tell is being made by people who grew up loving this food and like you can feel the history of the food, I'm immediately like desperate to make sure that people are coming to it and eating there so that it can stay. My thought isn't how can I learn to make this and make my own version of this, right? And I think like appreciation looks different. When you appreciate something, you appreciate everything that created it and sustains it and you invest in that. And when it comes to food, a lot of times what people want is they don't want to stretch or learn or maybe sit with the harder to immediately digest parts of it, whether that's the history, the culture, or even just certain ingredients. And to appreciate the entire thing. They want to fast forward and put it through their own cultural lens so that it's immediately digestible. And that isn't what respect looks like. And that's not what care looks like. And it's not sustainable. And it's just a quick way to actually divorce food from what it was and divorce it from the culture that sustains it. And, you know, we've even seen, you know, issues where an ingredient that was long disdained suddenly becomes popular and then the culture that created it can't afford it anymore. Yeah. And it's not sustainable then, you know, and basically what we're doing is just destroying and, you know, we have to, that's not what love looks like. That's not what respect looks like. And I think that a lot of times when we look at this, so often when people come to me and they're like, how can I not do this? They're not actually coming from a place of real respect and love because the question is how can I have this? How can I make this mine and not how can I make sure this continues? How can I make sure this grows? How can I give back for what it's given me? And that's what love and respect looks like. And so I think oftentimes when people are even asking that question, I think it's really easy to know how to love and respect something. It's the same way we love and respect other people, right? We don't come up and say, I love you and you're mine and I want to take all your best things and nothing else and discard you when you're an empty husk of yourself. It's the same for any other cultural product too. You want it to sustain, and everyone that I love, everything that I love, I try to think of how to sustain it and how to grow it and how to invest in it. And you love it for what it is and not what it is to you, you know, not how it can, you know, be useful for you in that moment. And we need to look at food the same way.
All right, so there was a lot to unpack in that video. I'm just gonna throw out a couple things that stood out to me, and then I'm gonna open the floor for others to share. I appreciated the fact that she pointed out, or I think it may have been the moderator that pointed out, that some foods and dishes were born out of necessity. And then now once it's in different hands, it becomes a delicacy that is very pricey. For example, enslaved people were giving the remains of animals and things like chitlins and the feet of animals and the necks, etc. And how that has been spun and in some places now that's a delicacy and priced accordingly. The other thing that stood out to me is when they talked about divorcing food from its culture, and that's not what love and appreciation and respect looks like. And then just the Kool-Aid pickles, like for someone to take the Kool-Aid pickles and that's now a thing that you do a news story on and is circulated when kids in areas have been doing that for years. So those are just some things that stood out for me. I'm going to open the floor. If there's something that caught your attention or you want to reflect on or pose a question to the group, please either put that in the chat or put a question mark in the chat, and then I'll know when to call on you so you can unmute. And while you are doing that, I'm going to put the link to that video in the chat in case anyone wants to watch the full clip or to share that. And remember, the classroom teacher in me is coming out. This is Courageous Conversations, which requires participation. So while I would never call on anyone, I will pause again and intentionally allow space for anyone that wants to share. Sherry or Sally, I see that your hand is up. Go ahead and unmute.
I attended a workshop a few months ago given by a tribal woman, I think Ojibwe, but I can't remember specifically, from northern Minnesota, who in her retirement is growing varieties of plants that were native to her peoples, and then in an organization with another organization making baby food out of them. It's called Indigibaby. And the concept is that by retraining the bodies of children to accept the foods that their families were raised on, it can try to reverse some of the health problems that the native population experiences, having been given commodity foods in the past that their bodies weren't equipped to handle. Wisconsin connection, she lives in northern Minnesota. Wisconsin connection, which I think is very cool, is a farmer in Wisconsin was tilling and somehow dug up a pot that had seeds inside of it, and he gave it to somebody to grow out, and it turned out to be this amazing squash that was from a long time ago, and now they're using that squash to put into the baby food. So it's kind of a beautiful example of using products or varieties of plants that would have been characteristic of years ago, and then feeding the new generation of children on those foods.
Sally, thank you for sharing that. As a mom who nursed and then made my own baby food, I support all of that. I just call mine mommy's best, but yeah, I like Indigibaby. Other items that you want to share, go ahead, and if you are on camera, you can raise your hand. I'll see that. If not, go ahead and throw the question mark in the chat. Sarah, I see your chat. Thank you for putting that in there for everyone to see. She says happy Chinese New Year, and she put information in there about what you, yeah, Sarah, feel free to unmute and share.
Well, and I see Wanda has her hand up. So I don't want to take up Wanda's space. But yes, I will share. Wanda, do you want to go first though?
Girl, go ahead. Go right ahead.
Okay, so hello everyone.
Polite and courageous conversations.
My name is Sarah. I'm zooming from Evansville. I'll show one. I got a couple kids here, so I've been kind of quiet. I have 3 of my own, and then my nephews and nieces. So I just wanted to share. Thank you for doing this. This is my first time sitting in on this on the Courageous Conversations. I've heard great things about this group. I've been part of the Becoming Better Neighbors meetings that are happening in Evansville. And yeah, anything that has to do with food, I'm all about. It's been a great way for me personally to reach other people and talk about my background being half Chinese. So my mom is full Chinese and my dad is full Caucasian. And yeah, it's been a great way, especially with kids in the school district here and not knowing any other Chinese families except the restaurant owners of our restaurant. So I try really hard to always cook dumplings and noodles and share it. And that's been great. As it relates to this conversation specifically, I was thinking we tend to use a lot of meat in our food. And when I asked my mom about that, you know, for example, like 1 whole chicken breast, they would use to feed a family of 5. And I think here we're used to like a whole chicken breast on your plate, maybe 1.5 if you're at Olive Garden. And that is due to just not having the resources to purchase meat. It's very expensive. So I'm going to show you guys some Chinese dumplings because we're in the middle of Chinese New Year and cooking. But this is what we had with dinner tonight.
Beautiful.
Thanks for letting me share. I'll jump off now so it's quiet.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And we enjoy babies. That's no problem at all. Miss Sloan, I missed your hand. Please forgive me. I'm mute.
It's okay. I was unmuted. This has been really good. And I just want to say everything is so politically and racially charged. But I think this subject probably needs, you know, a forum, a workshop, a weekend discussion. It reminds me of the struggle that the Black farmers have been going through for more than a decade, you know, a couple of decades, and how, again, how we decide, we meaning the government or whoever, decides who to support. Like, I have no problem with support going to Ukraine. However, it's always like, you know, why can't we help our Black farmers, you know, produce the food that they've been producing, you know, all of our lives that we know. I mean, our parents and grandparents and ancestors, you know, always had a garden. And so we lose so much of our cultural identity because of the, I guess, you know, discrimination and bias. But I just wanted to say this is so informative. I'm going back and watch all of these YouTube and the videos that you show because they're very informative to me. But I also think that somehow we need to come together and probably have a 1.5 day forum on this you know, particular subject, because it's really racially and politically charged. And with the Supreme Court election coming up soon, people just really need to be a lot more aware of where a person stands on very important issues like this. Okay, so I'm stopping because you know, Amy, I can go. Thanks.
Look, we have another 16 minutes, so you take all the time you need, Miss Sloan. But no, you brought up a really good point, and Black farming is near and dear to my heart. I mean, my grandparents, may they continue to rest in peace, but
yeah.
Joe Thomas Coleman, I was in Mississippi every summer, and you weren't coming in that house until you picked a bushel of peas. And once you
Absolutely.
picked that bushel of peas, you were shelling the peas.
Yes.
You didn't like peas, but
Yes.
if you weren't getting around that. Miss Delamay, there was some work to be had. So yeah. And then in the videos that Leah Pennington had in 1910 was the height of Black farming, and that was at
Absolutely.
4%.
Absolutely.
14%. And today, I think we're right around 2% for Black.
If that. And we have to be very careful about the validity, if you will, of those statistics, because a lot of these things are not really following and not really monitoring as they should be monitored. So, I always have a little bit of anxiety when I read these statistics. So we shall see. But this is a very good program, very informative. I'm glad I was able to join tonight. Thanks, Amy.
Oh, absolutely. And I just want to give a shout out to the team, because Julie Hermanson and Amy Flown picked out half of those videos that I shown, and they worked really hard on the concept for this Courageous Conversation and finding those videos. So thank you, Julie, and thank you, Amy. Definitely effort.
Yeah, thank you.
Excuse me. So I have one more video, and then we're going to open the floor for any remaining questions. And then we'll have any partner announcements, and then we will roll into the parking lot. So the last video is pretty short. It's a little poetry. We like to give you different forms of medium here. So just give me a second. I will pull this up.
As a child, my father would tell me stories of ancient Egyptian warriors traveling for endless days and nights across infinite desert plains, showing signs of endurance and bravery I could only dream of emulating. He would tell me that upon their return home, these warriors would be welcomed with a feast worthy of their bravery on the battlefield. Years later, as a teacher in Greater Washington, D.C., I too now find myself traversing a desert, though it is not the one I envisioned. A food desert. It's categorized as a poor urban area where residents cannot afford or are not given access to healthy foods and grocery stores. Every day at 2:45, I watch my students hop on this leaking submarine of a school bus, every block bringing them deeper into an ocean where the only fish they find are fried, where fruits and vegetables just can't be found because there are no grocery stores here. Just liquor stores and Popeyes, Dunkin' Donuts and 7-Eleven's. Children born into a neighborhood that feels more pollution than solution. It is then I realize that I am not too far from the deserts I once dreamed of. See, whether Anacostia or the Sahara, it doesn't make much difference, because the Whole Foods, Southeast DC, is no different than the Serengeti. To them, brown-skinned little boys like my students are nothing more than walking cacti, just a piece of scenery this world has taught everyone to stay away from. Beyond literally has a landfill in her backyard, so she has a hard time convincing herself the world doesn't just think she's trash. Restaurants come and dump the remains of food she'll never be able to afford to eat 3 steps from her back door. Jose, he's fast food 5 days a week because his mother works 3 jobs to take care of 6 kids and only sees her son when she arrives home from work. At the same time he's leaving for school, he has gotten so big that the excess fat bunkered beneath his skin puts added pressure on his joints and knees, are literally crumbling under the weight of this world. Olivia watched her father shot 2 feet from her front porch. She wants nothing more than to go outside and play at the park after school, but gun violence has made a merry-go-round feel more like Russian roulette, so she doesn't go outside. Simply eats any processed food from the cabinet that will last long enough to prevent her from leaving the house too often. These are my students, my warriors, fighting a battle against an enemy they cannot clearly see. These kings and queens meant to feast, not to fester, but their zip code has already told them that their life expectancies are 30 years shorter than the county 7 miles away. I can see the faults of my own ancestry shaking in their eyes. Diabetes and high blood pressure run through the roots of my family tree. Heart disease is as much a part of my history as shackles and segregation. So from my father's kidney transplant to Olivia's asthma, these things are more than mere coincidence. Both grew up in places more accustomed to gunshots than gardens. So tell me place doesn't matter. Like the neighborhoods that are predominantly healthy aren't the same ones that are predominantly wealthy, because when you're not choosing between buying your medicine and your groceries, health doesn't have to be a luxury, doesn't have to be an abstract concept presented in academic journals and policy briefs. My students overcome more every day than I will in my lifetime. They are the roses that grew from the concrete, the budding oasis in the heart of the desert, and their lives are worth far much more than the things that this world has fed.
All right. So we've covered a lot this evening. Sherry and Joe, we are so grateful for you. We love when we can come in and have local speakers that have real world experience on the ground, can tell us how to best engage and support the work that you're doing. I'm so very excited to hear that. Neil, I see your hands up. Go ahead.
I just want to remind people, as usual, how to save the chat, because it's something that I have had trouble with along. So you go to the chat, and in the right side, there are three little dots. You click on the three little dots and it will say save chat. And then you click on that. And then you have to find it. But all you have to do is look under Zoom and it will show up somewhere.
Thank you, Neil, for that reminder.
Sunday, my son works across town.
Go ahead, Diane. Yeah, Diane, go ahead. I'm sorry, the next video started, so I just needed to meet that. Please unmute.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just think that because of these food deserts, so the young kids are growing up eating the bad foods, and that's all they will eat these days. I think they need to be, you know, educated in schools, raising their own food so that they're, I've heard that kids that raise their own food, they're more willing to try it, like carrots and things like that. Kids these days don't go for anything good. They're not going to go for anything green. They're going to go for the fast food. They're going to go for the fries, donuts, stuff like that. That's what worries me.
So Diane, I appreciate your concern. Now, one thing that I will tell you that I've learned as a parent, if a kid gets hungry, they'll eat. And if you put something healthy in front of kids and they are hungry, that's what they are going to eat. I am encouraged. I know that, and I'll just speak for Beloit. I know that shout out to the Todd Timberwolves. My daughter always loved vegetables. Madison, ever since she could walk, I remember I was cooking Thanksgiving dinner and I could see this little hand. She was like 2 and she's like snatching peppers. And I tell her, I'm like, Sean, find out where she's sticking these peppers so we don't find them 2 weeks later. He's like, she's sticking them in her mouth. And I'm like, oh, okay, you eat all the peppers you want. Sean, on the other hand, and he's gotten so much better. But there was a point, he probably won't mind me sharing, if you gave Sean vegetables, which we did repeatedly, it was like we were feeding him arsenic. Those were the faces he was making. And I'm like, you're fine, eat it. So Todd Timberwolves, Todd has a community garden that's managed by teachers at the school. And that I'm like, sign him up, because the same premise. I'm like, if he grows it, he'll eat it. And I will say that helped a lot. So yeah, so there are opportunities for our kids. You just need to seek those out and find out what we can do to expand those. Again, Beloit is so fortunate to have the Merrill Community Garden as well. So seek out these opportunities, not just for our kids, but for community members as well. But Diane, yeah, it takes parents and guardians to make decisions for them and really say, hey, this is what we're eating tonight. I will say that one interesting point in that podcast that I need for you all to listen to, it talked about how parents who had lower incomes had found themselves saying no so frequently to their children for things that they wanted because they couldn't afford them, that when it came to food, sometimes junk food was the easy win. It was a thing that I could afford, that I could say yes to, that made my child happy, that made some of the other no's softer. And I never really considered that. And then another interesting point that they brought up is like the labor involved in creating a meal, and how sometimes parents will trade off that quick, easy meal so that they can spend more time with their kids. And I'm like, well, it would be in an ideal world, bring everyone into the kitchen and cook together. So cook that healthy meal and spend time together. But it's a complicated solution with lots of complicated issue with lots of inputs. Sally, I see that your hand raised. Is that old or is that new?
It's
That
Sarah.
is new, but I think Sarah was first.
Oh, okay. Sarah, please go ahead and unmute.
I just want to respectfully disagree that kids are always eating junk. And I have two things to kind of prove my point. As a teacher in Beloit, I'm retired now, but when I was there, they had a program where fresh fruits and vegetables were served as a snack. And sometimes it was your basic stuff, like, you know, they got a bag of carrots. Sometimes it was star fruit. So everybody got to try all kinds of new things. And I rarely had kids who rebelled against trying a bite. They might not like it, but they try it. The other thing is currently I am working with a tutoring program at our church and we have about 20 fourth and fifth graders, and we have fruits and vegetables out every week, as well as some home baked goods kinds of things. Every time I take a fruit and veg or a veggie tray with dip, I bring nothing home. So I am encouraged to see, I'm encouraged by that.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. You're giving us hope. Sally, go ahead.
I came back from a farming conference over the weekend. The keynote speaker was a Black woman from Wichita, Kansas, who has a farm and a mobile clinic that they take food to. They started with aging population, stopping at senior centers, and the seniors would buy the food with their dollars, whatever, food share dollars. And they have gotten through the pandemic. This company has gotten a lot of federal support. And so they've been expanded to 5 different counties, I think she said. Really amazing, energetic woman. And she was collaborating with several other people at the conference to expand that program to other places. So those kinds of innovative, energetic, brilliant contributions are encouraging from the point of view of bringing people of color into the farming community, where they have, as Leah said, so much historical knowledge. So I just wanted to throw that sort of happy information out there, that there are some changes coming.
Sally, thank you so much for sharing that. We have arrived at 6:58. We're going to do some quick community announcements from our partner organizations, and then I'm going to pass the mic over to Neil, and he's going to open the parking lot and take it from there. My only announcement is just really a thank you. YWCA Rock County was the lead in organizing the Dr. MLK program on Saturday, February 14th. So hopefully many of you had a chance to join us at Black Hawk Tech. We were the lead organizer, but it was definitely a team event. And I don't know if many of you know this, but we have no budget for this event, and it always comes together with volunteers. It's always a beautiful event that is centered on our children and really just a show of support for the community. so many organizations. I think there were about 10 different organizations this year come together and donate their time and their talent and what they have. So we make it work without a budget, which is always amazing to me. Thank you to Black Hawk for donating their beautiful renovated space. We were back in person this year after being, I think, virtual for the last 2 or 3 years. So it was just a beautiful celebration of community and uplifting the legacy of Dr. King. So thank you for everyone that came out. Neil, do you have any announcements from DAT?
I do not have any announcements from that, but I do want to say thank you to the YW for taking the lead for the Martin Luther King thing, because DAT has been involved with it from a long time ago, and we've really appreciated the leadership that you've provided lately.
A labor of love. It was absolutely, it's one of the funnest things that I do in my job. Julie, any announcements from community action?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, because I can't get my video to show. I just wanted to let you know that the WERA program, which is the Wisconsin Emergency Rental Assistance Program, is ending at the end of this month. So if you know of people that are still in need of assistance, they need to get their paperwork in by then.
Okay.
Okay, and Community Action has a couple new programs that are on the website. So if there's anybody who wants to check them out, feel free to pop on the site and see what you can find.
Perfect, Julie, thank you so much. So before we end tonight, I just want to thank Sherry Tossler again. You have taught us so much. Joe Loker, I got your name right this time. Thank you so much, local community partner who gave us a lot of good information. I think we all have a better handle of what it is that you do and what the parameters are and how we can be of assistance. So we're grateful for that. And we're grateful for you sharing some of your time with us this evening. Much appreciated.
I'd just like to say thanks and introduce one last thought for people to think about as I leave. We talked about food deserts or food apartheid, and I'd like people to think about their enrollment in their local school breakfast and lunch programs and whether or not those are little tiny food deserts that we're not considering and whether or not there's food apartheid there. We could give you some data if you're interested and want to work with your local school systems about increasing enrollment in school breakfast and lunch as a means of ending or reducing hunger in both Janesville and Beloit. So feel free to reach out to me.
No, I love that. And I just like happy news. I'm a huge supporter of the school district of Beloit. And I just want to report that the school district of Beloit does have free breakfast and lunch for all of our students. Doesn't matter, you know, we're about 70% free and reduced lunch eligible, but we have free breakfast and lunch for all of our kiddos. So
that's
yeah.
called community eligibility, Amy. Mm-hmm. And we're glad that you guys have it. Now, the bigger question is how many kids are eating it?
Mine are.
I'm going to be finding you later, Amy. Okay.
Oh, please do. I love that. All about it. Keep me accountable, Sherry. All right. We have run over a little bit, but I think it's for a really good cause. I'm going to end the recording.